Hi there, my name is Neil Huizinga, and I'm a Program Manager with Microsoft Dynamics AX. Today I'm going to show you how to define and maintain environmental conversions. Environmental conversions are used to define the relationships between flows within a process map. So if we look at a simple process map, we can see that we have a utility providing heating oil to a warehouse, and then the warehouse is emitting CO2. Now these relationships are defined by process references, but the material or the numerical relationships between the incoming oil and the outgoing CO2 are defined using a conversion. You define conversions by going to Compliance and Internal Controls under Common Environmental Sustainability, Environmental Conversions. Here we can see the system has some conversions built in already, but we're going to add some new ones. We're going to add a new conversion to describe the emissions factors for oil. So the conversion type is either incoming or outgoing, meaning that it's triggered by either flows that are coming into a process or flows that are going out of a process. In our case, we're going to use an incoming because we're going to attach this process or this conversion to the warehouse process. You can set an effective begin and end date to describe the period of time that this conversion is valid for. Now this is a pretty simple conversion that's not likely to change. So we're just going to leave those empty to describe this as saying it works for all time. Our origin substance is going to be heating oil. And our amount is going to be 1 gallon. So this says for every 1 gallon of oil that is consumed by the warehouse, we're going to produce some other flows. Now we have to select which processes are related to this. So we're going to just select one here today. We're looking at the vendor warehouse. So this says now, for every gallon of oil consumed by the vendor warehouse, we're going to produce some output flows. Finally, we get to the meat, the output flows. So for every gallon of oil we consume, we're going to produce 0.01 tons of CO2 equivalents. And those CO2 equivalents are going to flow from the vendor warehouse to the ecosphere. So now the whole picture is 1 gallon of oil consumed by the vendor warehouse produces 0.01 tons of CO2 emitted to the ecosphere. So every time I create a transaction that causes oil to flow into that warehouse, we're going to produce new flows of CO2 coming out of that warehouse and going to the ecosphere. So that was a pretty simple scenario. There are more complex ones involving multiple interacting conversions and both input and output types. I have a map here of a set of processes. We have our warehouses, which I'm pretending they're factories today, and they consume aluminum and produce aluminum. Not really produce, but they have leftover aluminum that goes to the scrapyard. So we have a vendor who sells us aluminum. In the process of creating aluminum, he emits CO2. Then we have our processes which process the aluminum and then send the scrap to the scrapyard. So defining the conversions for this scenario are a little bit more complex than the last set. We're going to produce aluminum. The conversion type is outgoing because we're talking about production here. Now, conversions have a scope that can be used to override the scope of the flows that trigger them. In most cases, you're going to use none because you're going to just trust that the original flows are the proper scope. But in this one, we're going to be really specific and say that all flows related to this conversion are considered to be tertiary. Again, we're going to leave this from and to date to cover all time. The origin substance is aluminum, and we're going to measure it by the ton. The related process is our wonderful new aluminum vendor. And the output flow is CO2 equivalents. Now, you'd have to do research to get high accuracy numbers here, but you produce about 0.05 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminum. The source process is the aluminum vendor, the destination process is the ecosphere. So, now we've said for every ton of aluminum that's produced by the aluminum vendor, we're going to produce 0.05 of a ton of CO2, and that takes care of that. So now we have that relationship figured out. We know what the impacts of producing that aluminum are when it gets to our door. Now we want to know what the impacts of processing that aluminum are. So we create another conversion for processing. This is of type incoming because we're bringing the aluminum in. The scope is going to be primary. We're just going to override any of the scopes from the flows to say, well, this is our own process, so we're going to say everything's primary. From and to time are still all of time. The origin substance is again aluminum, and 1 ton. Now we're going to add references to our warehouses, the main warehouse and the transit warehouse, because those are the ones that are consuming the aluminum. And then we select the output substance. The output substance is going to be aluminum again, but in a smaller amount. So we're going to say for every 1 ton that we consume, we produce 1/10 of a ton, so 90% of the aluminum ends up in our products, 10% ends up as scrap, and that goes out to the scrap yard. Now you'll notice that I've left the source process empty here. That means that when this conversion is processed, it'll actually choose the source process based on the destination process of the flow in this case. So if we have a flow of aluminum that goes into one warehouse, that'll be used as the source for this output of scrap. And if we have a flow of aluminum that goes to a different warehouse, then that warehouse will be used as the source for the scrap flows. And now we need to look at making sure that our conversions actually execute. Now, your conversion calculations can be run either manually or as a batch. You can set up the batch to happen as often as you want. Most people are setting this up to run once every few days. It depends on what your flow, the amount of flows that you're getting into the system. You can filter by what transaction types. You can do an additional filter using the sysquery form to limit what types of flows you're actually going to process. Most of the time you're going to leave these to include everything. And then you just say OK, and it'll execute all the conversions that are in the system and produce new flows for all of your inputs. Now you know how conversions are created, what types of conversions exist in the system, and how they're used. I hope you enjoyed it, and take care.